My name is Richard Halloway, and when I turned 70, I thought I had already lived the arc of my life. I had built something out of nothing, carried it through storms, and believed it would outlast me. The Halloway family business was not just a company. It was the spine of our name, the reason folks in the county respected us. It began half a century ago in a creaky garage behind my father's farmhouse. We started with second-hand tools, oil-stained hands, and a determination that outshined our lack of capital. Over the years, that garage became a workshop. The workshop became a warehouse. And by the time I was 40, we had an office building with our name carved into stone. Halloway and Sons Manufacturing supplied half the region with farm equipment, steel fittings, and custom machinery. Every barn, every mill, every construction site within 50 miles had a piece of our work inside it. For decades, I poured my life into it. My wife, Eleanor, kept our home steady, while I kept the company steady. Our sons and nephews grew into their roles, some on the factory floor, others in the boardroom. I believed I was handing them not just a business, but a legacy, one bolt and one handshake at a time. By the time I hit 70, my hair had turned white. My hands bore scars of iron and grease, and my voice carried the gravel of a man who had yelled over machinery for too many years. But my mind was still sharp, my instincts still clear. The business world may have shifted toward computers and consultants, but I had learned to adapt, and Halloway and Sons continued to thrive. Or so I thought. The first hints came quietly, like whispers through office walls. At the quarterly meetings, my nephews would exchange glances when I spoke. My eldest son, Charles, polished in his tailored suits, would say things like, "Dad, we value your input, but the market's different now. Younger leadership might bring a fresher vision." At first, I brushed it aside. Families evolve, generations step forward. But behind their words was an impatience, an eagerness to move me out of the way. I saw the hunger in their eyes, not for the work itself, but for the title, the authority, the pride that came with being the head of the Halloway name. One Friday evening, as I was leaving the office, I overheard Martin, my youngest nephew, laughing with another manager. "The old man still thinks he's indispensable," he scoffed. "He doesn't realize the company's already moving past him. We're just waiting for the right moment to show him the door." The words struck like a hammer to the chest. After 50 years of sweat, sacrifice, and leadership, I was no longer the patriarch holding the business steady. To them, I was a relic, a placeholder, a man standing in the way of their ambitions. That night, I walked the quiet halls of the factory alone, listening to the echo of machines I had once assembled by hand. My heart was heavy, but my resolve was harder than the steel we forged. They believed I was too old to matter. They thought I would step aside quietly when the time came. But what they didn't understand, what they had never learned, is that I hadn't survived 70 years by giving in to whispers. And if they truly meant to cast me out of the house I had built, they were about to learn what happens when you push a man who still holds the blueprint. The boardroom had always been my arena. Its long oak table bore the weight of contracts, arguments, and decisions that shaped entire livelihoods. I had negotiated there through recessions, strikes, and supply shortages. But on that spring morning, as I sat at the head of the table, I realized the boardroom had changed. Not the room itself, the same leather chairs, the same brass clock on the wall, but the people inside it. My sons and nephews filled the seats, younger men in fitted suits, eyes glued more to their phones than to the financial reports before them. Charles, my eldest, sat to my right, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile rehearsed. Martin lounged at the far end, whispering into the ear of our cousin Darren, both of them stifling laughter like schoolboys. I cleared my throat. "The second quarter numbers show steady growth," I said, tapping the report in front of me. "Sales are up 8%, and our new steel line has landed contracts in 2 neighboring counties. That's proof our traditional methods are still competitive." Charles offered me that polished smile. Dad, no one doubts your experience, but times are shifting. Markets today demand innovation, branding, partnerships, tech investments. Younger leadership can relate better to those demands. Is that so? I asked, my voice low. When I signed our first contract in '79, do you think they cared about branding? They cared about whether the machines worked and whether we delivered on time. And we did. Martin leaned forward, bold enough to interrupt. With all due respect, Uncle Richard, what worked in '79 doesn't work now. You still use a fountain pen in meetings. We need to think digital, global. And frankly, he glanced at Charles, we need leadership that understands today's pace. A few heads around the table nodded in agreement. It was subtle but unmistakable. The alignment of loyalty away from me and toward my son and nephews. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I steadied myself. I built this company from nothing, I said, each word deliberate, with these hands. And as long as my name is carved into that stone outside, I will not be pushed aside by men who think modernity is more important than integrity. Silence hung heavy for a moment. Then Charles leaned back, folding his hands. No one is pushing you aside, Dad. We're just preparing for the future. Preparing. That word clung to me as I left the meeting. Preparing didn't mean suggesting. It meant planning. It meant plotting. Later that week, I overheard Martin again, this time outside the elevator. Charles is ready to take over, he whispered to Darren. The old man won't know what hit him. It'll look like retirement, but really, it's replacement. They laughed softly, confident in their secrecy. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reveal myself. I simply walked past them with my head high, as though I hadn't heard a word. But in my heart, I knew. The whispers of replacement had already turned into a plan, and sooner than I expected, that plan would become a betrayal played out in the open, in front of the very company I had given my life to. The day it happened was dressed in ceremony. Charles had called a special meeting of strategic importance, his words polished like silverware. I arrived in my gray suit, tie knotted stiffly, briefcase in hand. At 70, I still made it a point to walk tall through the front doors of Halloway & Sons, greeting workers by name as I had done for decades. They smiled at me. Loyalty lived on the factory floor, even if it was eroding upstairs. The boardroom was crowded that morning. Not just my sons and nephews, but lawyers, advisors, and even a consultant whose crisp accent betrayed the fact that he had never lifted a wrench in his life. The atmosphere buzzed with something rehearsed. Charles stood at the head of the table, my seat, and began with a speech that sounded more like an obituary than a business update. For 50 years, my father has been the guiding hand of this company. His legacy is unmatched, and his wisdom has brought us prosperity. But as markets change, so must leadership. It is time to look forward. I sat still, my jaw set as he went on. Martin rose next, holding up a polished binder. We've drafted a leadership transition plan. It positions Uncle Richard as chairman emeritus, honorary of course, while Charles and I assume executive control. This ensures stability while preparing for growth. Honorary? I repeated, my voice steady. You mean powerless? Murmurs rippled through the room. Martin smiled like a man who believed he'd already won. Not powerless, Uncle. Respected, celebrated, but relieved of the day-to-day burden. At your age, isn't that what you want? At my age. Those 3 words struck harder than any punch. Charles gestured toward the consultant, who clicked a projector to life. Charts and slides filled the wall, growth projections, rebranding strategies, even plans to expand internationally. We need fresh vision, Charles declared. Investors demand it. The workforce demands it. And respectfully, Dad, you've done your part. It's time to pass the torch. I rose slowly, the room falling silent. My hands pressed against the oak table I had bought with my first real profits, 40 years ago. I carried this company through recessions you only read about in books. I mortgaged my house to make payroll, when banks turned us away. I've walked every inch of the factory floor and bled on those machines. And now you tell me I'm finished because I've lived too long? Charles shifted, his composure slipping for the first time. Dad, it isn't personal. It's business. No, son, I said, my voice firm. It's betrayal. And betrayal always feels personal. For a moment, no one moved. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and slid a document across the table. Mr. Holloway, the board has already voted. With your signature, the transition will be complete. I stared down at the paper. My name was printed neatly, waiting to be erased by ink. Around the table, their faces watched eagerly, as though my surrender were inevitable. I lifted the pen, held it between my fingers, then set it back down. If you want this company, take it. But know this. A business isn't just signatures and titles. It's survival. And survival isn't guaranteed. With that, I walked out, the weight of decades pressing against my shoulders. Behind me, I heard Martin whisper triumphantly, "It's done." But what none of them realized was that sometimes, the moment you push a man out of his own house, you've set the fuse for its collapse. And when the walls fell, I knew I would be there, waiting. The announcement came on a Monday morning. Mondays had always been the lifeblood of the company. Trucks rolling out, machines firing up, men and women clocking in with coffee still warm in their mugs. But that Monday, instead of gathering on the factory floor, the workers were herded into the courtyard where a makeshift stage had been set up. I stood off to the side, invited but unprepared, as Charles stepped forward with a microphone. He was radiant in his suit, polished shoes gleaming, his voice carrying the smoothness of a man rehearsed for applause. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today marks a historic moment for Holloway and Sons. After 50 years of service, our founder, Richard Holloway, is stepping aside to enjoy a well-earned retirement. His vision built this company, and his sacrifices carried us through storms. We honor him today as Chairman Emeritus, a title befitting his legacy." Polite applause rippled through the crowd, but I could see the confusion in the workers' faces. Men and women who had labored beside me for decades. They clapped because they were told to, but their eyes searched mine for answers. Charles motioned for me to step up. I walked slowly to the podium, feeling every gaze upon me. He pressed the microphone into my hand like a token, and for a moment I considered saying nothing. But silence was surrender, and I wasn't ready to surrender. "I thank you," I began, my voice steady, "for walking this road with me. For 50 years we built this company not with fancy charts or empty words, but with sweat, trust, and long nights when payroll seemed impossible. I see those nights in every face here." The workers listened intently, though Charles shifted impatiently behind me. "And while they call this a retirement," I continued, glancing back at him, "let me be clear. It was not my choice. I was shown the door, told my age was a burden, told I had no place in the company I bled to create. But know this, you are the backbone of Holloway and Sons, not the men in suits who think legacy can be traded like stock." A hush swept the courtyard. Charles stepped forward, his smile forced. He clapped loudly, trying to steer the moment back under his control. "Let's give my father one more round of applause for his incredible service." The crowd clapped again, but it was different now, hesitant, uncertain. The seed of doubt had been planted. That afternoon, my office was stripped bare. Boxes of my papers, photos, and ledgers were stacked like unwanted relics outside the door. My nameplate disappeared from the wall. Martin and Darren moved into my space before the dust had settled, laughing about modernizing the old man's corner. I carried my boxes out quietly, nodding to workers who avoided my eyes. They were loyal, but they were also afraid of choosing the wrong side, afraid of speaking truth to power. When I reached the parking lot, Ruth was waiting by her car. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "They think they've won." I looked back at the building. my building, and felt the fire rising in my chest. "They've taken my title," I said, "but they haven't taken my knowledge. They don't realize how fragile it all is. And when it crumbles—" I placed the box in the trunk and shut it firmly. I'll be the only one left who knows how to pick up the pieces. The first days after I was forced out were the hardest. For 50 years I'd woken up before dawn, dressed in the same work boots, and walked the factory floors before the machines roared to life. Suddenly my mornings were empty. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, staring at the clock as if it mocked me for having nowhere to go. The town noticed too. At the diner, old friends glanced up when I walked in, their nods hesitant, their smiles pitying. One of them, a man I'd once hired as a machinist, whispered to another, "Guess the old man's finally hung it up." The words stung more than I let show. Retirement had been their story, not mine, but I had no way to rewrite it. At home, Ruth tried to fill the silence. She dropped by with casseroles, urging me not to lose heart. "You are the company, Richard," she insisted. "Without you, it won't last." But in those quiet hours, I doubted her. The building still stood. Trucks still came and went. Charles strutted through town like a prince. Martin bragged about expansion deals, and Darren preened about global partnerships. To the outside world, Holloway & Sons looked strong, and I, sitting on my porch with my ledger and my memories, looked like a man left behind. One afternoon, I drove past the factory just to see it. Workers stood outside smoking, their faces drawn. I slowed, rolled down the window, and asked Earl, one of my oldest foremen, how things were. He shifted uncomfortably. "They've cut overtime," he said. "New management says it's more efficient, but the orders are piling up and the men are grumbling." I nodded, my chest tightening. Efficiency, they called it. Neglect, I knew it to be. Another week passed, and whispers reached me through town. Late payments to suppliers. Machinery left unrepaired. Fancy dinners billed to the company card while welders waited for their checks. It was the same pattern I'd seen 100 times in competitors who rose fast and fell faster. Arrogance. They mistook expansion for strength, appearance for foundation. Still, I kept my distance. Pride told me to march back in, to confront them, to demand they treat the business with the respect it deserved. But something heavier held me back, the realization that they wanted me to interfere, to explode, to prove their whispers right, that I was too old, too stubborn, too out of touch. So I stayed silent. I walked the fields behind my house, studied the books I'd brought home, and waited. Because if age had taught me anything, it was this. Collapse doesn't come with a bang. It comes with cracks, small at first, widening over time, and I could already see the cracks forming. They thought they had dismissed me, but I knew the truth. They had dismissed the only man who truly understood how fragile their empire really was. From the outside, Holloway & Sons still looked like the proud fortress I had built. Trucks rolled out each morning, the smokestacks hummed, and the office windows glowed late into the night. But to anyone with eyes trained by decades of survival, the cracks were spreading like frost across glass. I saw them everywhere. At the diner, Earl muttered over his plate of eggs that he hadn't received his overtime pay in weeks. Denise from the credit union told me quietly that the company had stretched its line of credit to the breaking point. A supplier from the next county called me by mistake, thinking I still handled accounts. "Richard, your boys haven't paid for the last shipment. Do you know what's going on?" I listened, I nodded, and I filed every word away. But I never once stormed into the office to correct them. Not yet. That was the part that they didn't understand. Patience is not weakness. Patience is strategy. From my porch, I watched Charles's shiny sedan speed past most mornings. He liked to arrive late, make a show of importance. Martin, on the other hand, was all bluster. He bragged in town about global deals and future-proof strategies. Words so hollow I could almost hear the echo inside them. Darren paraded around in tailored suits, snapping photos for glossy brochures, while machines sat idle for lack of parts. And still the workers held on, out of loyalty, out of habit, out of hope that the family name still meant something. But I could see it in their faces when they passed me on the street. Their patience was thinning. One evening I invited Ruth over and spread the company's old ledgers across my dining table. The thick books smelled of ink and oil, each page filled with figures I had written in my own hand. "See here," I told her, pointing to a column from the recession of '91. "We cut bonuses, but never payroll. And here, during the drought years, we held back expansion until cash flow was secure. That's how we survived." She looked at the fresh reports I had managed to get my hands on, fancy charts printed on glossy paper, filled with projections that reached higher than reason. "They don't have your discipline," she said softly. "No," I replied. "They have hunger without restraint, and hunger without restraint always ends in ruin." I leaned back, steepling my fingers. The anger that had once burned hot in me now smoldered cooler, sharper. It wasn't about storming back in and shouting down their arrogance. It was about waiting, watching the cracks widen until the structure gave way under its own weight. Because I knew something they didn't. While they were chasing glory, I was quietly securing influence. Buying small debts here, calling in favors there, aligning myself with the very banks and suppliers they depended on. Piece by piece, I was weaving a net beneath their feet. And when the fall came, as I knew it must, I would be the one holding the net. The silent observer they thought I was. But in truth, I was the architect of their reckoning. By summer, the shine began to wear off. The banners Charles had ordered for the new era of Halloway and Sons still hung over the factory gates, but their fabric fluttered in the wind like a taunt, a promise already unraveling. Inside the company, mismanagement grew louder than the machines. Orders went out late. Supplies arrived half-filled because invoices hadn't been paid. I heard from Earl that some of the welders were buying their own gloves because procurement had streamlined expenses. Imagine that, men giving their skin to keep the place running while the new bosses sat in air-conditioned offices drafting expansion strategies. The arrogance of it all made my blood burn. Martin had convinced Charles to launch a risky international partnership with a distributor in Europe. They announced it at the country club, champagne in hand, acting like kings of an empire. But no one in the family had the foresight to hedge against currency shifts or shipping delays. Within weeks, the deal bled red ink. Darren, meanwhile, poured money into flashy marketing campaigns, glossy magazines, billboards with slogans like "Innovation through Youth." He forgot the truth I had lived by. A company is not saved by slogans. It is saved by paychecks arriving on time. And Charles, my eldest son. He was the most dangerous of them all because he believed his own image. He carried himself as though the company existed to crown him. He spent more hours at luncheons with bankers and lawyers than walking the factory floor. He told anyone who would listen that Halloway and Sons is entering its boldest chapter, yet. But I knew better. Boldness without caution is just gambling in a suit. The first storm cloud appeared in the form of a notice from the bank, late payments on the company's primary loan. Then came murmurs from suppliers about short-term delays in invoices. Then a client pulled out of a contract, citing missed deadlines. One by one, the pillars began to shake. I saw it clearly while the rest of them were blind. Pride had made them deaf to warning signs, but pride can't silence creditors. It can't silence workers with empty wallets. From my quiet perch, I kept listening, kept watching. Every whisper of discontent, every notice of overdue bills, every eye roll from men on the line when Charles gave another empty speech. These were not random problems. They were cracks widening, water seeping in before the flood. And in my desk drawer, my ledger grew heavier. I had begun buying up pieces of their debt, small at first, nearly invisible. A supplier's overdue invoice here, a subcontractor's lien loan there, Nothing grand enough to catch attention, but enough that threads of control were slowly weaving into my hands. They thought they had banished me, but I knew the storm was already here. The only question was how long before lightning struck, and when it did, who would be left standing in the rain. It started like a slow leak in a roof, quiet enough to ignore but relentless. By autumn, the leak had turned into a downpour. The first blow came from the bank. A public notice was pinned to the courthouse board. Halloway and Sons in arrears. Folks in town read it with raised brows, whispering over their morning coffee. The same people who'd once clapped for Charles's speeches now traded looks of doubt. Suppliers began to demand cash on delivery, no more extending credit. One even drove straight to my porch, hat in hand, asking if I knew what was happening. "Richard, your boys owe me $40,000, he said. "They've promised 3 times, but my trucks can't run on promises." I told him only what was true. "Keep your invoices. You'll be paid, but not by them." Inside the company, panic crept through the walls. Workers whispered that paychecks might bounce. Overtime had been cut entirely, and shifts were shortened. The break room talk wasn't about pride in the Halloway name anymore. It was about finding work elsewhere before the ship went under. The second blow came when the European distributor pulled out of their contract. Shipping delays, unpaid fees, and unkept promises had soured the deal. Martin, red-faced, called it a temporary setback. But in truth, it was a hole punched in the hull of a sinking vessel. Then came the lawsuit. A client in the next county filed for damages after a late delivery cost them a harvest contract. The papers hit Charles like a hammer, and for the first time, his polished confidence cracked. By winter, even the employees knew. The once bustling factory slowed to a crawl. Machines that had rung like church bells now stood silent for hours. Trucks sat idle in the lot, and when I passed by, I saw men shaking their heads, saying words I never thought I'd hear. Maybe the Halloways are finished. At home, I watched it all unfold like a man watching a fire from a distance. I didn't lift a finger to save them. Not yet. It wasn't my job anymore. They had made that clear when they boxed up my office and paraded my retirement in front of the workers. Instead, I sat at my desk with the lamp burning low, writing in the same ledgers I'd used all my life. Each debt they failed to pay, I marked. Each creditor I quietly relieved of their burden, I added to my growing portfolio. One by one, the strands tightened. They owed the world, but the world owed me. The business was collapsing. That much was obvious to anyone with eyes. But what my sons and nephews didn't yet realize was that when the floor gave way beneath them, the only solid ground left would be the debts in my name. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be me begging for help. It would be them. The summons came, not through an official letter, not with the formality of a board notice, but through a phone call late one evening. Charles's voice, once polished and commanding, now cracked like old wood. "Dad," he said, pausing as if the word itself burned. We need to talk. Tomorrow, at the office." I let the silence hang long enough for him to feel it, then answered simply, "I'll be there." The next morning, I walked into the building that had once been mine. The banners proclaiming a new era of Halloway and Sons still drooped over the lobby, faded now and curling at the edges. A receptionist I didn't recognize tried to smile, but the fear in her eyes betrayed the truth. Everyone knew the company was sinking. They gathered in the boardroom, the same boardroom where they had staged my humiliation months earlier. Charles sat at the head, his tie loose, his eyes hollow. Martin paced, sweat beading on his forehead. Darren shuffled papers nervously, his slick confidence long gone. "Dad," Charles began, forcing a smile that crumbled instantly, "we're facing some challenges. Cash flow issues, suppliers demanding payment up front, the bank threatening foreclosure." "Some challenges," Martin echoed, slamming a fist on the table. "It's sabotage. The economy, the distributors, the—" "No," I cut in, my voice sharp. It's not sabotage. It's mismanagement. You bled the company dry, chasing vanity projects, and ignored the foundation it was built on. Don't dress it in excuses." They fell silent, staring at me like chastised children. For a moment, I almost pitied them. Almost. Charles cleared his throat. "Dad, we need capital. Enough to keep operations going until we can stabilize. We know you still have resources, investments, connections. If you could lend us—" "Not a loan," Martin interrupted desperately. "An infusion, equity. You'd be back in the fold, but as an advisor. We'd keep the leadership structure." I held up a hand, and the room froze. Slowly, I reached into my satchel and laid out a stack of papers, each, marked with signatures and seals. Their eyes widened as they realized what they were seeing. "These," I said, tapping the documents, "are the debts you owe. Supplier invoices, bank liens, subcontractor notes. All purchased, all transferred. Every unpaid dollar you thought was scattered across the county now belongs to me." Charles's face drained of color. Martin stammered, That's impossible. No one man could. One man who's been watching while you squandered what he built?" I leaned forward, my gaze fixed on theirs. "Yes, one man could." Darren whispered, You're our largest creditor." I nodded. "Your only creditor that matters. The bank listens to me now. The suppliers answer to me. The ground you're standing on, it belongs to me." Silence swallowed the room. The very men who had laughed behind my back, paraded me out like an artifact, now sat pale and trembling in the ruins of their pride. Charles finally spoke, his voice barely audible. What do you want?" I stood, gathering the papers back into my satchel. "I don't want. I own. And starting tomorrow, I decide whether Halloway and Sons rises from the ashes, or whether I let it burn." Their eyes followed me as I walked out, their desperation hanging in the air like smoke. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. Not because they begged, but because I'd waited. Patience had done what anger could not, and the men who thought they'd buried me were now kneeling in the dust, waiting for me to decide their future. The following week, Charles called for an emergency board meeting. It wasn't optional. The bank had issued a final warning. Suppliers were refusing shipments, and the workers were threatening to strike unless wages were guaranteed. The empire they'd claimed as their own was collapsing brick by brick, and desperation left them no choice but to face the truth in front of everyone. I arrived early. The boardroom was packed, not only with directors and managers, but with representatives from the bank, suppliers, and even a few employee delegates who had demanded to sit in. Tension hung in the air so thick you could almost taste the fear. Charles tried to open with authority. "We are here to discuss restructuring options for Halloway and Sons. Temporary setbacks have strained cash flow, but with new agreements and fresh capital—" "Fresh capital?" One supplier cut in, his voice sharp. "You've owed me $70,000 for 6 months. My trucks won't roll another mile for you until that's paid." The banker added coldly, "Foreclosure is already filed. Unless a primary creditor steps in, this company is insolvent." The room erupted. Angry voices, accusations, panic. Charles pounded the table, shouting for order, but the sound was drowned in chaos. That was when I stood. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my satchel on the table and withdrew the thick bundle of documents I had carried for months. "Enough," I said, my voice steady but cutting through the noise like steel. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me, the old man they had shoved aside, the relic they had mocked. "These debts you're all fighting over," I continued, spreading the papers across the oak table, "no longer belong to scattered banks and unpaid invoices. They belong to me. Every supplier note, every overdue account, every lien the bank filed, I bought them." The banker leaned forward, flipping through the documents with wide eyes. "It's true. These are legally transferred. Richard Halloway is now the majority creditor." Gasps rippled through the room. Charles went pale, his mouth opening and closing without words. Martin muttered, This can't be." Darren buried his face in his hands. I looked around at the managers, the workers' representatives, the people who had kept this company alive while prideful heirs tore it apart. Holloway and Sons was built on sweat, not vanity, on honesty, not greed. And as of this moment, by right of ownership, I reclaim control. Effective immediately, I am reinstating myself as head of this company. One of the suppliers banged the table approvingly. The worker delegates exchanged relieved glances. Even the banker nodded. "With his backing," he said, "we can renegotiate terms. Without him, there's nothing left." Charles staggered to his feet. "You can't just walk back in here and—" "I didn't walk back in," I said, my gaze locking on his. "I never left. You only borrowed the keys, and now the locks have changed." The room erupted again, but this time not in chaos. It was applause, small at first from the workers, then spreading. Relief, respect, vindication. Charles sank back into his chair, broken. Martin's bravado evaporated. Darren stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. And I stood there, not triumphant, not gloating, simply unshaken. The house they tried to cast me out of was mine again, not because of sentiment or pity, but because I had outlasted them. Patience had delivered me the final word. I was no longer just Richard Holloway, the man they called too old. I was Richard Holloway, the man who owned their future. The first morning after reclaiming control, I walked back into the factory not as a guest, not as an outcast, but as the man whose name was still carved into the stone above the entrance. The workers paused when they saw me. Some nodded, some whispered, and one old welder named Hank grinned ear to ear. "Told him the old man wasn't finished," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. The factory floor smelled of steel and oil, familiar, grounding, but there was also something else in the air. Relief. The whispers that had haunted the place for months were shifting, turning into hope. I called a company-wide meeting that afternoon. In the courtyard where Charles had once staged my retirement, the employees now gathered again. But this time, the stage was mine. I stood tall, a man of 70 who had survived humiliation and betrayal, but whose voice carried steady as iron. Holloway and Sons was never built on fancy charts or empty promises, I began. It was built on your backs, your hands, your long hours when paychecks came late, but the work still got done. I was pushed out because they thought my age meant weakness. But you know better. You lived those nights beside me. Faces nodded in agreement, arms folded, heads bowed. They remembered. From today forward, I continued, overtime is reinstated. Pay will be guaranteed on time. Repairs on machinery will not be delayed for vanity projects. We go back to building with discipline, not gambling with dreams. Applause erupted. It wasn't just noise. It was trust returning. Later that evening, I called a private meeting with Charles, Martin, and Darren. They filed into the boardroom, stripped now of their swagger. Charles's suit looked rumpled. Martin's hands shook. Darren couldn't meet my eyes. "You wanted the crown," I told them, "and you wore it proudly. But a crown is heavy. It crushed you." Charles finally spoke, his voice thin. "Dad, we were trying to modernize, to grow." "No," I said sharply. "You were trying to shine. Growth is built slowly, brick by brick. You built castles in the air and expected them to hold weight." I slid 3 documents across the table, formal notices of removal. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all executive duties. You may retain minority shares, but decision-making authority is mine alone. Martin exploded. "You can't do this. We're family." I leaned forward, my eyes steady. Family doesn't forge betrayals. Family doesn't mock blood in public. Family doesn't gamble away 50 years of sacrifice. You made yourselves businessmen. Now face the consequences as businessmen. Silence followed, the kind of silence that comes when pride has no fight left. "You will remain silent partners," I finished. You will draw modest dividends if the company prospers. If not, nothing. You will not interfere again." Charles lowered his head. Martin bit his lip until it bled. Darren whispered, "Yes, sir." For the first time since they had ousted me, the balance of power was clear. The men who had thought me irrelevant now sat as children before their father, stripped of illusions. As they left the room, I remained seated at the head of the table, staring at the old oak grain beneath my hands. They had tried to erase me from this seat, but now the table, the company, the very legacy, they were mine again, and the men who thought they had buried me were forced to watch as I wrote the next chapter without them. Word travels fast in Maplewood. By the end of the week, everyone knew what had happened inside the walls of Halloway and Sons. The whispers that had once carried my supposed retirement now carried something very different. Richard's back in charge. The boys nearly ruined everything. Guess age still knows better than youth, after all. At the diner, where Charles had once strutted in with polished shoes and ordered steak in front of clients, he now slipped quietly into a corner booth, eyes down, waiting for the room to stop staring. Conversations hushed when he walked by, then picked up again in judgment once he passed. Martin, who had been the loudest voice mocking me, faced even sharper ridicule. The same men he had bragged to at the country club now avoided him like a man carrying disease. The European deal he had bragged about was a punchline. Global expansion, huh? Couldn't even pay the local feed supplier. And Darren, with his glossy brochures and empty slogans, couldn't show his face in church without feeling the burn of Reverend Clay's sermons about pride and humility. Even his own wife was said to have scolded him in the grocery store aisle, loud enough for neighbors to hear, "You lost the family's honor chasing billboards." It wasn't just their public image that collapsed. Their finances followed. Charles had leveraged personal credit to cover gaps in the company's cash flow. Debts now called in. Martin's SUV vanished from his driveway one morning, repossessed. Darren sold his lake house quietly, hoping no one would notice. But in a town like ours, nothing stays hidden. Meanwhile, the company, under my steady hand, began to stabilize. Workers were paid on time, overtime returned, and suppliers who had once threatened lawsuits now shook my hand with renewed trust. Orders trickled back in, not because of flashy promises, but because people remembered the reliability of the Halloway name when I was at the helm. One Saturday morning at the farmer's market, a neighbor clapped me on the back. "Richard, it's good to see you running things again. The town feels right with you in charge." I nodded, not with pride, but with quiet satisfaction. Vindication doesn't come from shouting down your enemies. It comes from standing steady until the truth shows itself. As for my sons and nephews, their fall was not just financial. It was spiritual. To be publicly stripped of authority, to be pitied where once they had been envied, that is a humiliation deeper than debt. They walked through town shadows of the men they had tried to be, and every glance reminded them of the truth. They had betrayed the legacy, and the legacy had turned on them. They had called me too old, too irrelevant, too out of touch. Yet here I was, walking taller at 70 than they had ever walked in their prime. Their fall was slow, grinding, and humiliating, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The factory gates creaked open each morning just as they always had, but the rhythm inside was different now. Not frantic, not chaotic, steady. Machines hummed, trucks rolled out on time, and men whistled again as they worked. The air smelled of steel and sweat, not of fear. And in town, the silence spoke louder than words. Where once neighbors had asked in hushed voices, "Is Richard finished?" they now greeted me with nods of respect. At the hardware store, clerks carried my bags without being asked. At the diner, old farmers pulled up chairs at my table again. The whispers of my weakness had turned into murmurs of admiration. The old man outlasted them. He saved the company. Charles, Martin, and Darren still lived in Maplewood, but they had become shadows in the community. Charles walked with his head low, his tie loose, avoiding eye contact with the very people he used to lecture. Martin stopped going to the country club entirely. Too many sideways glances, too many jokes at his expense. Darren shrank into himself, the man who once preached innovation through youth, now unable to even look me in the eye at church. I never gloated. I never rubbed their humiliation in their faces. Justice, I had learned long ago, doesn't need a parade. It needs patience, and patience had given me everything. At home, Ruth joined me on the porch one evening. We watched the sun sink over the fields, the light painting the estate in shades of gold. She leaned on the railing and said, "You didn't just save the company, Richard. You reminded everyone that wisdom has a place in this world." I took a long breath, letting her words settle. "Funny thing about wisdom," I said, "it doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it waits. And when pride trips over itself, wisdom is still standing." The cicadas sang in the distance, and for the first time in months, I felt peace seep back into my bones. I didn't need applause. I didn't need revenge painted loud. The quiet respect of my workers, the nods from neighbors, the knowledge that truth had endured, that was enough. My enemies had fallen not by my hand, but by their own arrogance. My vindication was not a banner in the street. It was silence, the kind of silence that follows a storm, when the air is clear and the land, though battered, still stands. And as I sat there in the fading light, I realized that silence itself was the sweetest justice of all. Winter laid its blanket across Maplewood, soft and unhurried. The fields shimmered under frost. The barns wore crowns of white, and the Whitaker clock in my farmhouse kitchen ticked as faithfully as it had for decades. Each steady chime reminded me. Time had tested me, and I was still standing. The company was mine again, not by inheritance, not by ceremony, but by survival. The same survival that had carried me through recessions, droughts, and betrayals. I had not clawed my way back with shouting or fists. I had simply endured. Age had not been my weakness, it had been my armor. My sons and nephews had once mocked me, called me relic, old man out of touch. They had believed signatures on paper were stronger than years of sweat written into steel. But their empire had crumbled, and I remained. In town, when people spoke my name, they no longer did so with doubt. They said it with respect, with the certainty that the Halloway name still meant something, because I had not let it die. I did not hate Charles, Martin, or Darren. Hate is a fire that consumes the man who carries it. What I felt was something colder, heavier, disappointment. They had inherited a legacy, but they had tried to spend it like loose coins. In the end, the legacy had slipped through their fingers, back to the man who understood what it cost. One evening, I sat at my desk and opened my father's old ledger. The pages smelled of ink and dust, carrying the weight of generations. At the bottom of the last page, in my own hand, I wrote the words that would outlast me. Strength is not in youth alone. Strength is in endurance, and legacy belongs to those who wait. I closed the book and placed it gently back on the shelf. Outside, the snow fell steady, quiet as truth. For all their pride, my sons and nephews had learned the lesson too late. Betrayal may wound, but patience buries. And as the farmhouse clock ticked on, I leaned back, letting peace settle where anger once burned. Because justice, I knew now, doesn't always come with a shout. Sometimes justice comes like winter snow, quiet, cold, and absolute. If this story struck a chord with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more true-to-life tales, and tell me in the comments, do you believe age is a weakness or the greatest strength of all?